Very good. Well, a very good evening to you all. If you're normally at the LSE, lovely to see you. And if you're visiting, you are very welcome this evening. My name's Tony Travers. I'm a professor in the Department of Government and the School of Public Policy here at the LSE. And I'm very pleased to be here to welcome our audience in the Sheikh Zayed Theatre, which is where we are, to the 12th annual George Lansbury Memorial Lecture, presented in association between the LSE's Library and Department of Government and the George Lansbury Memorial Trust, for whom many thanks. Now, before I get into the rest of the introduction, I'll just say this is, obviously an event about a former Labour leader talking about another former Labour leader. I thought it was just worth noting in pass that yesterday died John Prescott, former deputy leader of the Labour Party and deputy prime minister. So just thought I'd say that, no more than that. Neil may say one or two words himself when we get there. Anyway, so George Lansbury was a British politician and social reformer who led the Labour Party from 1932 to 1935. The George Lansbury Memorial Trust was founded in 2012 to celebrate George's contribution to local and national life and to promote awareness of the contemporary resonances of the issues in which George campaigned. I've been asked to note the Trust's thanks to LSE, I'm now thanking them, thanking me, but that's good. Thank the Trust for hosting this event, and to Poplar HARCA, who run the Lansbury estate in the East End, named in George's honour, for their continuing sponsorship of it. Each year since 2013, this George Lansbury Memorial Lecture focuses on one of many causes which George championed and reflects upon contemporary importance as well. These range from policy issues such as housing, London local government, refugees, relationships with Russia, to processes and causes such as feminism, Christian socialism, and political transformation. He had a wide range of interests. After 12 years, there are still many aspects of his rich and varied life and the causes that matter to him that merit revisiting in the light of contemporary developments. So, although George Lansbury is generally and rightly associated with the East End of London, he has links to the LSE, and they deserve, I suspect, to be rather better known. He wasn't amongst the LSE's founders, the Webbs and Bernard Shaw, but he did serve alongside one of those founders, Beatrice Webb, on the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws. He'd been a leading campaigner for poor law reform, and of course, as many of you who've studied history will know, actually was responsible for a rebellion at Poplar, where he refused to pay effectively the rates over that were due to the London County Council and others, was sent to prison for that. But actually the government changed the law and he was very popular for being sent to prison. He was, as we were saying earlier, a radical's radical by any standards. Many of his archives are deposited here at the British Library of Political and Economic Science. And I'm pleased to say that these are now being digitised and published, and many are now available online. So if these are of interest to you, you can search for George Lansbury archives online, and these are freely available to download and use. These papers touch on all aspects of his long and varied political career. One important dimension of that is political communication, our theme for this evening. He was, amongst other things, one of the founders of the Daily Herald, which was the first British newspaper to support the Labour Party. He took easily to the medium of newsreel and was one of those early communicators, politicians who knew how to use the media. So these are the themes our speaker tonight knows much about. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome our guest speaker, Lord Neil Kinnock, who is joining us today. Neil Kinnock elected Parliament as a Labour MP for Bedwellty in 1970.
That's very good pronunciation.
Thank you. I can say quite a lot of words in Welsh, actually. I can say stand by put gwingit and all that, but I won't tonight. He was made Shadow Education Minister in 1979. On a personal note, it's about that time I first met Neil, courtesy of the chair at the time of the Education Select Committee, Christopher Price. Remember Christopher Price? Like Lansbury, he was a leader from the left of the party who had to rebuild and discipline the party after the heavy defeat in 1983. Like George Lansbury, he didn't make it to number 10. He did, however, serve on the European Commission from 1995 to 2004, the last 5 years as Vice President. Following year, he was appointed to the House of Lords, also serving as the chair of the British Council. He thus brings a rich and varied career of his own to the topic tonight, and the topic being communication of politics, a case for treatment. Therefore, I should say, by the way, there's a hashtag for all of this, which I didn't read out earlier on, where it comes right before I get there. Oh yes, I've got it. It's here in front of me. Hashtag LSE George Lansbury. So, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Neil Kinnock, Lord Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Tony. That's very kind, and I really did enjoy your pronunciation. I hope that before the evening is finished, you will give us Llanfair, Pwllgwynydd, Gogaeth, Llandisylio, go. I've given you the abbreviated version. I wish I could do the same with the lecture, because I timed it this afternoon, and it's a little bit longer than I would have wanted. If you get fed up, either walk out or start clapping early, or boo, and then I might just get the message. Could I, first of all, because it actually would be inappropriate not to, refer to John, who died yesterday, John Prescott. He wouldn't want me to pretend that we were the best of buddies. In fact, we did have, for a prolonged period, a pretty strong animosity towards each other. That didn't dent his commitment to the Labour Party in any way at all, or his willingness, after the air had cleared a little, to continue to dedicate himself to supporting the efforts of change and modernisation of thinking and action in the Labour Party, which was always to his credit, and I always valued that. His great contribution, of course, was as Deputy Prime Minister, when, because of his gift for welding people together, getting them to overcome their divergences, getting them to understand the urgency of electing a government and then getting a Labour government to do Labour things when in office, which isn't always the easiest task, then he really does deserve undying credit. And I testify to his courage and to his determination and to his many attributes of charm, which mixed nicely on occasion with his ferocity, which I valued more than anything else, frankly. So he has been very desperately ill for some considerable time past. And he had Alzheimer's when he died yesterday, and I've got some personal experience of what that involves. And of course, as John very gradually left life, he would have been frustrated and furious by the growing disability. It's not an end I'd wish on anyone. And his family will now feel great grief, but also a sense of relief. So I hope he will rest in peace. Now, the first thing I have to say about this speech is that the subject is not really a very happy one for me, the role of communication in politics. I've had enough of communications shaping and misshaping politics to last me several lifetimes. And I'd readily never say a further way about it. However, the subject was prompted in my mind when I was asked to undertake this lecture by the very generous and patient Memorial Trust. It did occur to me when reflecting on the nature and the state of change in communications and politics over about 5 decades out of the 6.5 that I've been politically active, that we do need to attend to the changing nature of the relationship between communications and democratic politics. What follows, therefore, is not an explosion of accumulated geriatric whinging about how the media done me wrong, although I've got some bruises that are so enduring that they resemble tattoos. Instead, I'll try to outline how I see the evolution of the character and quality of media treatment of UK politics and the representation and digestion of politics in our democracy. In doing that, I have to offer what is now called a spoiler alert. My reflections, like the daily rages that you might expect from a powerless 82-year-old democratic socialist, manifest deep anxiety about present conditions and foreboding about the future. But I'll try to offer some practical suggestions for ameliorating change as well. That spirit of trying to provide progressive answers rather than simply listing ills would certainly have motivated George Lansbury. We gather in his memory this evening, and any proposals which he made would probably have relied more on faith, hope, and prayer than mine do. But his 10 years of experience as the editor of the Daily Herald, at the time an innovative national newspaper, would have kept his feet on the ground. And no one, as Tony indicated, no one could doubt his credentials as an intrepid foe of conventional deference. Meanwhile, I have to say that I don't believe in any power of prayer, but I nevertheless embrace, sometimes cling desperately to hope as a motivator. I have for many years sustained myself by coupling pessimism of the mind with optimism of the will, the combination recommended by Antonio Gramsci, who was Lansbury's communist Italian contemporary, imprisoned and murdered by Mussolini. With that to prompt me, I'll try to cover massive shifts in political communication in a way that won't plunge you into pessimism, but will give you some determination to be optimistic enough to insist on change. Long ago, in the late 1970s, the Conservative Party had recognized the potency of sharp, snappy prods and puns. Assisted by Saatchi and Saatchi, they'd ridden to victory on "Don't just hope for change, vote for it," which was sensibly copied by the Labour Party in this year's general election. And most effectively and disingenuously, and very memorably indeed, they succeeded with posters proclaiming Labour isn't working. Unemployment was at the time 1.25 million. 3 years after that, it was 3.25 million. My party, meanwhile, had mundanely failed to convince the nation that the Labour way is the better way. It's an inspiring slogan, and celebrated the return to opposition by very rapidly forming a circular firing squad. The blank rounds that were fired didn't actually kill anyone, but they did deafen the party to some basic realities. Among those were first, that governments have power to change people's minds by changing their lives and prospects. Oppositions, however, have to change minds without the power of doing. So they depend entirely on communication of ideas, of attitudes, of conduct, of common purpose. And secondly, political parties should heed the evening prayer of the Reverend Eli Jenkins in Dylan Thomas's Milkwood, the vicar of Tredegar. Ask the Almighty to see our best side, not our worst. And serious political parties should beseech that the electorate do the same. Those verities are so elementary and so simple that it could be assumed that parties in opposition would give priority, if not total primacy, to communication. Communication that is expert, focused, resonant, evocative, appealing to the breadth of the electorate. But for the faction that then dominated the direction of the party and its political activists, which as some here will know is not always the same thing as politically industrious, those objectives of expertise in communication were bourgeois affectations. Professionalism, polling, focus groups, and other dark arts of political communication would simply, they insisted, hand power to the image makers and steal their socialist souls. The faction therefore continued to concentrate on their efforts to secure and sustain power in Labour rather than winning power for Labour. Any focus on the voting public seemed to become an afterthought. And having urged Michael Foot to become party leader, they then turned his political life into purgatory and made Labour a byword for schism. So after further and even more devastating defeat in 1983, it was essential to uproot the attitudes that had invited the rout and to achieve modernisation of and greater relevance for the stances and presentation of the party. Thus began my midlife crisis, recorded in history as my leadership of the Labour Party. Now, obviously, I knew that wholesale correction of the condition of the party required action to deprive the factional influences of authority, and that had to be done through changing rules and rejecting and replacing very substantial policies. That was easier said than done because some of the policies had, for completely understandable reasons, attained almost religious devotion, even among some comrades who were not consciously part of any faction. The roots of unilateralism, the roots of commitment to nationalisation, the roots to no change in industrial relations legislation ran very, very deep. As I say, for completely understandable reasons. So the changes had to be pursued with the patience and persistence of persuasion and organisation. Declaration and denunciation would have been much more thrilling and suited my temperament, frankly, but also would have been a party-shattering failure. The changes, therefore, had to take years, too many bloody years. It unfortunately meant that I and those working with me had to focus almost obsessively on management, sometimes by using the weight of democracy, sometimes by victories in faction-to-faction combat, sometimes when the timing is right, by direct confrontation, sometimes by clandestine maneuver. To give an absurd example of that, I sprung the red rose on the Labour Party as an annual conference surprise, because I knew that if I tried to make the change, a symbolic change, through the National Executive Committee, it would be impeded by interminable public wrangling over the treacherous replacement of Labour's amateurist version of a Stalinist banner. The fact that the red rose had been used as an emblem by Nordic and other socialist parties for years, in some cases decades, would have made no positive persuasive difference whatsoever. So the punishment for all those years of self-indulgent introversion and the policies that stuck to it came, of course, in the ballot box, in the polls, in the press, and consequently in broadcasting. Plainly, the effects of all that were corrosive and cumulative. They were inevitably targeted on me, to the extent that Jim Callaghan, an admired friend but not customarily a Kinnock defender, said that he had never witnessed such relentless personal attacks before. I accept, of course, that my own flaws and inadequacies deserve blame for that and for much else. But subconsciously, I suppose, I acted on the ancient advice of an old Tredegar comrade, Councillor Walter Jones, a toughened veteran of the ruined 1930s and the secretary of the Query Group when Nye Bevan was the chairman, and also of the Tredegar Soviet that ran the town during the 1926 general strike. I'm not exaggerating use of the word Soviet, I'm telling you now. And Walter said, when I was a kid, never huddle, always struggle. So I pursued the necessary changes with the eventual assistance of communications that coherently, sometimes brilliantly, conveyed the authentic message that a changed Labour Party was a serious, responsible party in favour of efficient production as well as fair distribution, and preoccupied by the well-being, security, and future of our country rather than by its own internal machinations. I make this self-conscious excursion into the 1980s because it's relevant to the subject of this lecture. Some of my eventual successors had become deeply aware of the malign multiplier effects of the media treatment of the Labour Party and of me in the 1980s. John Smith, widely and rightly regarded with respect for his intelligence and political prudence, didn't feel motivated to develop a specific communications strategy. The small, fragile Tory majority that he inherited and the chaos of Black Wednesday assisted that and convinced him that one more heave would have been enough to win power. He was probably right about that. But many did not take that view. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were prominent among them. They'd been seared by witnessing the years of pillorying through the 1980s and into the 90s. And so, upon securing the Labour leadership, Tony immediately recruited the young tabloid journalist and occasional broadcaster, Alistair Campbell. He did so when we were all together on holiday, so I can bear personal testimony to the wrangles and trials of that. Alistair strongly, indeed ferociously, shared and acted upon his conviction that attack and defence through disciplined communications was the only feasible and acceptable course. Clearly, Tony had natural communications assets, and Ali was probably the greatest poacher turned gamekeeper in modern politics. Between them, they sensibly sought to win any positive coverage that was available and, if possible, to neutralize the negatives. I confess to rage at their 1995 excursion to the gathering of Murdoch executives in Australia. Not because, as I told them, they were supping with the devil, that goes with the territory of leadership, but because I thought that Beelzebub would exploit them as supplicants and that their collaboration would be fruitless. When that didn't happen, and instead the Murdoch papers supported Labour, I recognized that their effort had real value. My anger gradually dissolved, and I did warn, however, that Murdoch would eventually betray them when he'd had enough of social democracy. And of course that happened, but happily not for a long time. With the sun at their backs, therefore, the new Labour, new dawn was breaking. Now all of that, of course, was deep and real change in the way that communications shape politics and vice versa. But a long way from Australia, or from Wapping, or from Westminster, an even greater change was taking place. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, researching in Geneva, discovered how to connect hypertext with the internet to establish what he called the World Wide Web. I don't think Tim would object to me describing him as a lifelong, open-minded progressive living in the real world. And as someone of high intelligence and rational motivation, he anticipated that it would be a transformative means of liberation from borders on maps and in mines. That was sensible. Geopolitics around the time of the remarkable innovation included the collapse of communism under its own contradictions. It included the crumbling of apartheid, the combined military actions to eject Iraqi invaders from Kuwait in a classic application of the United Nations Charter. The latest wave of globalization was reducing barriers to trade and travel. In China, mass dissent, which bravely challenged despotism, was murderously repressed. But even in the midst of that, it seemed that the dissent itself was a sort of harbinger of change and possible progress. In such global conditions, optimism about the potential for spreading truth and for overwhelming lies, for advancing enlightenment and emancipation seemed justified. That positivity about illuminating communication was further boosted in the United Kingdom by the inauguration of rolling 24/7 news in the coverage offered by Sky News, also in 1989. In the United States of America, Fox News and Talk Radio, and like other truth-trashing right-wing media, benefited from being unleashed from the obligations of honesty and balance by Reagan's abolition of the 1949 Fairness Doctrine in 1987. But in the UK, Murdoch-owned Sky was bound by public broadcasting rules and conventions, and its pioneer operators intended, to their credit, to emulate and rival the BBC in quality and objectivity. And of course, they've now done that for 35 years. And indeed, they themselves provoke emulation. Radio 5 Live came in 1994, a BBC TV news channel in 1997, and ITN tried it for a few years at least. But most important of all, there was the internet. The combination of universal access to communication and consumption of news and views and perpetual broadcast provision for both was quickly grasped by established media, by limitless public, and by commercial interests. In the dozen years between the liberating fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the terrorist destruction of the Twin Towers in 2001, the internet achieved levels of circulation that vastly exceeded the extent of what had taken printing 5 centuries and broadcasting 8 decades to accomplish. And that was just the start. What became known as social media platforms using the internet followed and flourished. Facebook started in 2004, Twitter in 2006, Instagram in 2010, and TikTok in 2016. When I checked those dates, it struck me that they all seem to have arrived much, much further back in time than the actual dates. It really does seem now that even the newest of them have been with us for an endless period, but it is very recent and all in this century. And in this century, the spread of information to billions of people through social media was and is not merely wide, it is deep, very deep as innermost feelings of loves and hates, of passions and resentments. It facilitates social and anti-social interaction. It generates endless audiences. It extrudes stupendous profits through advertising. That means of expression multiplied prodigiously since 2007 through over 2 billion iPhones shapes communication and politics organically and inevitably and increasingly by deliberate contrivance. Sometimes that is for enlightened and benign purposes, sometimes with malignant motives. Those titanic technological inflections, going further and crucially faster than any previous industrial or cultural revolutions, have shifted the world of political and just about every other means of communication on its axis. And it's not been as benign as we originally hoped. Plural democracy gradually followed just a few steps behind the industrial and commercial revolutions of the 17th to the 20th centuries. The parliamentary revolution in the UK, the uprisings in America and France, Chartism, the Reform Acts, legislation of legalization of trade unions, adult franchise, the welfare state, rules-based order, all testify to the way in which civilizing development, democratic development, followed closely upon technological and cultural change. And the trouble is that the technological and communications revolutions of the 21st century seem to threaten to shrink democracy. To take one example, for print media, the rapid and massive loss of display and informative advertising to social media has cut income from that source by well over 50% in the United Kingdom national and local newspapers in 17 years. That and other technological change has meant reduction of over a third of mainstream and over a half of local and regional journalists in the same period. The results also include the concentration of ownership of the local press and the closure of over 200 titles since 2005. The increase of what one distinguished newsman called journalism, the withdrawal of specialist reporting, especially of civic and political journalism, courts and councils, in the locals, and of foreign and national correspondence, and industrial correspondence in the nationals has taken place at the same time and for the same reason. In national newspapers, deadlines now relate breathlessly to the next hour of rolling news, not reflectively to the next day. Public enlightenment has given way to public enthrallment. Coverage of celebs, show business, and the royal family, all much the same thing, takes precedence. Inevitably, the newspapers that still operate under the dictatorship of the bottom line that is vigilantly examined by the mainly tax exile owners of Britain's newspapers, that still means that they need to at least avoid massive loss. So speed, impact, shock and awe, fear and smear boost sales. Sensation, scandal, and various aspects of sexual behavior have been, or usually misbehavior, have been the main characteristics of some papers for decades. Now clickbait and easy, cheap, pasted material are also part of their stock output. Such conditions are not, of course, universal. There are editors of integrity and fine journalists still plying their vital trade. But the forces of shrillness, salaciousness, superficiality, proprietorial profit, and the capricious power that goes with making that profit and owning that resource are ranged against them. That matters, especially in an industry which has successfully resisted any of the meaningful regulation that was thoughtfully proposed by the Leveson report. Part 2 of that was, of course, amputated by the Conservative government in 2018. In this country, newspapers, for a variety of historical reasons, are more politically powerful than in just about any other democracy, though not as influential as they sometimes boast, and certainly not as significant as they were a decade or more ago. Their vitality and veracity, or lack of it, are still nevertheless very, very important, not least because broadcasters seeking news and opinion to provide accessible material inevitably and sometimes lazily echo the tone, vocabulary, and twists of the written press. And that occurs even when those broadcasters are consciously seeking dispassion and objectivity, either out of professional ethic or statutory duty, or both. Newspapers are obviously not social services, and they must be commercially viable to survive. But change, mainly propelled by social media, is moving from feeling their collar to grasping their throat, and they don't yet have a resilient answer to that. The paywalls introduced with the cooperation of Google and Facebook, of course, might protect revenues and journalistic standards for a while, especially amongst what used to be known as newspaper of record that tried to sustain that identity. But that means separation between people who can and will afford access to detail and reasoned dispassion in their news and comment, and those people who either can't or won't afford it. Both segments of society will still get information and opinion. There is insatiable demand for both, but one gets it from the deliberately erudite and professedly objective sources, and the other gets it from millions of chat rooms as consumers of the daily me. And that generally reinforces and feeds predispositions and includes false news, conspiracy theories, trolling, libel, and worse. If those travails were all confined by some miracle of divine intervention to print media, it would be deeply troubling and a menace to the veracity and dependability of information, which is, after all, the basic requirement of plural democracy. But of course, it can't be confined. Broadcasting is deeply affected and infected by newspaper output and the scramble for instant impact, the need for assertiveness, for aggressiveness, and for argument, which is more stimulating than discursive dialogue. There's a coagulation of ownership in local radio similar to the local press, and a comparable primacy is given to entertainment and presentation over substance. In addition, there is increasing development of ersatz mimic democracy in reality TV shows. They arouse passions, give rapid gratification, and offer the appearance of engagement through excitably reported voting. The race for ratings to draw adverts, justify budgets, nourish egos, validate existence, dominates so much of what pours from TV screens and increasingly from streamed output. As ever, the customs, practices, fads, fashions, and feed of print media virally influence broadcasting. Crisis is in, caveat is out. Chat is cheap, controversy easy. Facts are onerous, detail boring. Fresh news is up, reflected nuance is down. As complication increases, simplification explodes. In perpetual broadcasting, filling space and time means putting a premium on opinion and commentary, using speculation and conjecture, too often neglecting verified fact. Polarization is then guaranteed, indeed is compulsive, and it comes to characterize public discourse and public reporting. In a communications environment, information has expanded gigantically, and understanding seems to have dwindled with attention spans. The implications for democratic politics, which depends on the exchange and digestion of words and ideas, are obvious, and the effects are plain in soundbite vocabulary, as recent examples testify. Orthodoxy is everything that appears to have failed and is stale, not the product of experience and reasoning. Fiscal precision is abacus economics. Experts are part of a manipulative elite, not the source of proven truths. Mistakes are glibly consigned to the past and excused by the urge to move on. Sensitivity to the concerns of others is woke and a damnable constraint on unrestrained behavior and speech. And it's barely possible to say courteously, you are wrong, you are believing and supporting a lie, because that is patronizing, abusive, insulting, even though the worst condescending mockery of intelligence is the lie. Meanwhile, hustings for party leadership or general elections for current affairs panel discussions and political audience participation program. All those have studio sets, charts, animation, buzzing hosts that give the appearance of game shows. Balance in radio and TV exchanges is provided either by pitting climate change denying flat earthers against a proven expert, a scientist, or by duels between journalists who can give the impression of independence and objectivity in an entertaining and stimulating fashion. Politicians, it seems, must be regarded as all the same, or in it for themselves, or both, and merely used to recite party doxologies on Question Time and similar programs, unless they arouse newsworthiness by rebelling or by being controversial, which can mean anything from being gutsy and original to slightly eccentric or blatantly outrageous or offensively nasty or just plain bloody daft. In such circumstances, it's increasingly difficult to hope for sober political discourse. I'll never forget my toe-curling disgust when in the last general election, in the TV hustings, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer were required to indicate their fiscal policies with all of their complexities by answering yes or no to economic questions, an utter impossibility. And I was astounded by the fact that they didn't simply walk off the set. But of course, that is the greatest sin imaginable, so they couldn't do it. It's really small wonder in these circumstances that media notability, celebrity, rather than sober statesmanlike suitability or noble attributes, or even evocative brilliance, increasingly provide the path to power. Sometimes that can be fortunate. President Zelensky, a famous TV comedian with real qualities of political greatness, is a rare positive product of this environment. Sometimes, of course, the consequences are abysmal. Trump and Johnson are on a lengthening list of politainers, which includes Meloni and Farage. Some on that list may, of course, have reached preeminence on the basis of talent, courage, wisdom. Who can know when they've yet to demonstrate any of those qualities? All we can be certain of is that without the rocket fuel of being thought of as novel, disruptive, entertaining, and irony of ironies, anti-elitist, and deprived of the propulsion of social media, one of these distinguished people would be a bankrupt New York property developer, one a predictably controversial UK colonist given to Latin and Greek tags, and one a real ale guru and commodity trader in the city. At this juncture, I have to emphasize that I'm not speaking as a head-shaking octogenarian, bemoaning the loss of a golden age of integrity, objectivity, and gravity in politics and communications, and claiming that things were better in my day. There was no such halcyon era. There never has been. I'm simply, even plaintively, declaring that was then, this is now, and things are different. Different for communication and different for democracy too. That's partly because the communications climate for politics has been warmed through global shouting in print and broadcasting. But there are, of course, other developments which are contributing to mendacity, distortion, and misdirection in the information universe, and they are systematically organized. I haven't the expertise to offer you analysis and comprehension of the full nature and scale of the seismic wave of social media communication that is engulfing the world. Perhaps no one has that expertise. I simply observe that algorithms, a process of rules to be followed in problem-solving operations, especially by computer, enable analytics, the systematic computational analysis of data, which are engines of polarization and facilitate micro-targeting of individual consumers and, vitally, individual voters. And it is that which gives commercial, social, and political interests a weapon of influence and of persuasion that is unprecedented and unequal in all communications through all history. Like water and fire, that can, of course, be, and indeed has been, used for positive and progressive purposes, or it can be used for malevolent purposes. New technology and artificial intelligence might certainly provide answers to global crises ranging from climate change to poverty and the need for advances in healthcare. I'm no Luddite. I live in hope because I recall that from Obama's election to the Arab Spring, the Maidan Square Revolution, the courageous resistance that has been shaking Iran's theocratic despots, social media has been a force for good or for attempted advance. But meanwhile, Trumpism and even worse isms have successfully used the power of digital communication to pull millions towards the abyss of bigotry, hate, and violence, and they've done it internationally, nationally, and intimately. Amongst the casualties of that malignancy has been mental illness, especially amongst young people. And other casualties include truth, fairness, freedom, and democracy itself. Hacking, trolling, and anonymous, sometimes confected whistleblowing thrive for good or ill. They can enlarge transparency and democracy. They can also engender danger to both. Influences with no accomplishments or mandate now mold opinions through this means. Gaslighting, an old term with a new meaning, creates self-doubt and acquiescence. Bots, automatic programs, and troll farms are now part of our vocabulary. In their time, Hitler and Goebbels understood and exploited the potency of the newly arrived radio. Imagine if they'd obtained access to social media. Maybe there would be emulators, already have. When democracy was expanding and growing in use and confidence, institutions and rules developed to set parameters for debate. Commonly agreed facts could be subject to interpretation. People with different perspectives could nevertheless be connected to a shared reality. It obviously wasn't a state of utopia, but the ability to disagree without detesting was so conventional that its existence was only really noticed when it broke down. Increasingly and rapidly, it is diminishing now. A completely unregulated internet is slowly dismantling existing guardrails. Social media is helping to divide politics into self-reinforcing silos, filter bubbles, whose occupants are impervious to even the flawed debate in the mainstream or legacy media. Differences of opinion are intensified to a point where opponents or even people who look or sound differently or act differently become othered. They are then perceived as enemies that must be not merely defeated in argument, but demonized and eventually destroyed. 8 years ago, after the Brexit referendum and Trump's first victory, much was written about evidence of sinister data scraping, psychographic specialist organizations such as Cambridge Analytica. There were whole TV documentaries about them. And there were also documentary coverage of malevolent foreign entities like the Putin regime, using micro-targeted adverts on digital platforms to distort democratic outcomes. Concern was, and still is, justified. But the problem is not just the exploitation of digital platforms like Facebook or Instagram or X or TikTok that are commonly used. It's the way in which they are designed in the first place. Trump's 2016 campaign was more effective in its use of Facebook adverts because Facebook showed them how to do it, while Hillary Clinton's campaign ignored, indeed rejected, similar offers of assistance from the same platform. The digital potency of Trump's 2016 and 2024 campaigns and Farage's Reform Party in the United Kingdom does not arise so much from paid-for advertising. It comes much more from the organically viral qualities of apparently simple answers, indeed simplistic responses, misleading responses to complex questions. And when that doesn't provide an acceptable expression of preconceived opinions, people are encouraged by these media to rail against some faceless, all-powerful elite, and simultaneously to blame those who are weaker, more vulnerable, just different. And that shouting up and punching down is usually done anonymously. Several of those attributes have, of course, characterized populism through the ages. Now, however, there is a means of delivery which is faster and wider than ever before in human history. 30 years ago, the nerdy geniuses who introduced the Great Leap in communications facilitated social media and shared the innocent belief that breathtaking innovations and affordable technology would emancipate understanding and emancipate voices. That view was shared by democratic governments who regarded the hard-to-regulate nature of the internet as a virtue. Bill Clinton was not alone when he dismissed efforts by the Chinese to halt the advance of liberty that was facilitated by the internet, saying, "Good luck with that. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to the ceiling." The optimists in communications and politics were obviously partly right. There is more knowledge. There is more freedom of expression. But there are also organized distortions of knowledge and deliberate offenses against freedom. In the maelstrom of bias confirmation and systematic falsehoods, the alt-right, or fascists, as I prefer to call them, in order to economize on time, and the dictatorship states have realized that it isn't always necessary to suppress facts and truth in the manner of the old bigotries and the old tyrannies. It's only necessary to diminish respect for and trust in both facts and truth. Ostensible democracy, counterfeit democracy, can be manipulated. It can sustain the appearance of freedoms, of accountability and diversity, while serving the purposes of those who control the state and consequently control the system. Faced with those realities, I believe that democracy, which is still buttressed by values and components of reasoning, of tolerance, justice, plurality, truth, equity before the law, must take a stand against the perversion, using its mighty power of legitimacy. In doing so, democracy will have to embrace the reality that accepting, supporting freedom of expression means enduring its abuses of that right while contesting the distortions. It would not be justified or possible or desirable to shut down freedoms of expression in order to combat the distortion of expression. The tools for securing change, therefore, have to be resilient, rational discernment. When they go low, we go high, and crucially, the rule of law. That's not nanny state. It's recognizing that whilst freedom of thought cannot and must not be controlled, sustainable and universal freedom of thought, of markets, of communications, of conduct, has to be defined, has to be protected by proportionate rules set by informed deliberation that establishes accountable and enforceable regulation. And that must include psychometric micro-targeting, so that data management by an ill-motivated, well-funded few does not displace or corrupt the clumsy but answerable democracy of the many. Neither the social media corporations nor democratic legislatures can achieve this kind of change in regulation on their own. Achieving and applying the necessary reforms in social media and all that derives from it, including its power to manipulate consumer tastes and political opinion, all that will require unprecedented and continual collaboration between the tech giants and democratic governments and institutions. That is not a wishful hope, it is a tangible possibility. The tech moguls have an almost exclusive monopoly of data, the oxygen of the digital cosmos. So they have monumental power. But crucially, most of them understand that such ascendancy must carry colossal responsibility. That is because, with a few notable exceptions, they are liberal progressives, and they manifest that in a variety of ways, sometimes through instinctive altruism, sometimes maybe as a constructive cosmetic or as a project of personal vanity. The important factor is that they manifest responsibility, whether it's because it's in their nature, or because of rational philosophy, or because it's simply good public relations. Those who are dutiful to democracy are consequently horrified that their innovative genius, while expanding freedom, has also facilitated intolerance, fanaticism, poisonous populism, and worse. They further know that authoritarian regimes, including China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others, are twisting the internet to enable suppression and surveillance on an Orwellian scale, while denying the tech platforms unconditional access to the territory of the despots. It's worth noting, of course, that all of the corporations, including those led by the self-appointed warriors of free speech, tamely conform to the requirements of the dictatorships. Nevertheless, enlightened personal convictions, the realities of freedom in democratic societies and its absence from tyrannies make most of the tech giants cherish stable, open societies, value free markets, and respect the creativity of liberty. They want to sustain those invaluable conditions. That combination of personal principles and public concerns has already encouraged some of the leading innovators to introduce modest systems of restraint, self-policing, self-supervision. Even Mr. Elon Musk used to say that he doesn't want a hellscape, although in the 2 years since he used those words, he's not given the impression that he's going to fulfill that intention. On the contrary, Musk is now, following the re-election of Trump in the first mainly social media contest in political history, is going to be in government, though uniquely in a role that allows him to continue his commercial activities. He is, without doubt, deeply political. He must consequently be assessed through the lens of partisanship. He has personal wealth of over $250 billion. He has significant operations in strategic industries and services, including batteries, software, and electric vehicles. He has similar holdings in AI ventures, space rocket and launch technology. He also has satellite internet connections to remote areas, including Ukraine. And he has ownership of more satellites than the total owned by all of the governments of the world. Donald Trump's program of deregulation, of protectionist tariffs and subsidies will hugely benefit Musk. Indeed, he has gained $50 billion since the day after the presidential election. In short, Elon Musk is probably has the greatest unaccountable power of any private individual in all history. Even if he offered the impression, or indeed the reality, of being a benign emancipator, his monolith of omnipotence could not be acceptable in the 21st century. The impunity enjoyed by the ultra-wealthy throughout the ages cannot be permitted for Musk or indeed anyone else. He said of himself, "I wouldn't say trust me entirely." He should be taken at his word. Riches, as Proverbs tells us, so it's been known about for a long time, hath not innocence. Unassailable riches and power, as common sense and history tells us, have to be assailed in the cause of liberty, prosperity, and humanity. We can take some encouragement from the fact that steps towards accountability, regulation, and restraint have been taken by some of the tech giants so far. They are hesitant, they are limited, but they do indicate advances towards what Tim Berners-Lee called maximizing the public good. But that will obviously not be enough by itself, certainly not enough to ensure the dominion of the common good. That's only possible if democracy exerts its power of legitimate authority. Since governments cannot realistically displace the might of tech, they will have to recruit it, using, if necessary, the implied or actual threat or application of sanctions, including further taxation, licensing, huge fines, supervision, controls on output, and enforceable legal roles on advertising, electoral practice, and ownership. That process of regulation has already begun in several democracies. The European Union's Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and Artificial Intelligence Act, all agreed by 27 member states, are a start, certainly not a conclusion, to multinational regulation. In the United States, Google has been convicted as a monopolist. In Australia, there are formal proposals to stop under-16s using social media, while similar proposals are said to be on the table of our government. The chief executive of Telegram is assisting the French police with their inquiries, and a Brazilian judge has shut down Elon Musk's X platform for multiple offences. Earlier this month, Robert Habeck, the Vice-Chancellor of Germany, said the regulation of algorithms of X or TikTok through the application of European legal norms is a central task. We cannot, he said, place democratic discourse in the hands of Elon Musk or Chinese software. Here in the UK, by happy coincidence, since I doubt if the Secretary of State had heard I was going to give a lecture on this subject tonight, so by happy coincidence, he published his draft statement of strategic priorities for online safety. He published it yesterday. It reaffirms the government's commitment to implementing the Online Safety Act, although experts say that's a step in the right direction, but is not yet really catching up. But it's better than a standstill. And he has also, the Secretary of State has also declared that any company afforded the privilege of access to the UK's vibrant technology and skills ecosystem must also accept their responsibility to keep people safe on their platforms and foster a safer online world. That statement consequently focuses on 5 complementary themes. They include safety by design to stop harm occurring, increased transparency and accountability of online platforms, maintaining regulatory agility to keep pace with technological and behavioural changes, and other requirements that will change the environment in which online communications operates in our country. All of the instruments of regulation that are being and must be considered by democracies across the world have precedence in the last 200 years of society's efforts to civilize the hidden hand of unrestrained enterprise. Those controls started to come into being even when the franchise was rudimentary and tycoons and nobles ruled. The scale of the task now is greater and more dynamic than ever, but the nature of the task of introducing effective civilized controls is similar to so many precedents. In this century, mature democracies surely have more power to legislate and to apply protection if they choose to use it. While the tech companies could indeed probably will try to find ways of evasion and impunity, and maybe temporarily succeed, the means of doing that would be expensive and exhausting even for them, especially if the new statutory environment becomes multinational, as it must in order to be effective. At the very least, changes now should include, first, making platforms legally recognized as publishers because they manifestly issue information to the public and are not merely messengers. Algorithms must not be protected by commercial confidentiality, an inconsistency that is ridiculous as well as dangerous. Thirdly, tech tycoons and their companies must be subject to personal liability for the content they promote, rather than subject to corporate fines, which, however large, are merely regarded to be operational costs. And fourthly, in the USA, where the precedents do exist, and elsewhere, the tech corporations must be dealt with antitrust laws, just as the energy giants were at the beginning of the last century. That's clearly unlikely to occur in the next 4 years, when the oligarchs will own the White House and other components of US government. But it will come at some time, if for no reason other than the need to sustain competitive capitalism. Meanwhile, the difficulty is that our democratic institutions are analog in a digital age. A colleague of mine put it neatly: politics moves at the speed of elections, the technological revolution moves at the speed of electrons. One idea advanced by more enlightened elements in the tech world, and they exist, is to build a public interest for every new algorithm. They understand that faced with changes in the statutory and operational environment, it would be better for the tech giants to assist internationally with the design and implementation of arrangements needed to ensure against exploitation and vindictiveness, against anonymity and animus, and for information, choice, enlightenment, and knowledge. And this generation of tech owners needs to do it now, before mortality overtakes them or control of their companies moves to other powers. Ladies and gentlemen, to state the obvious, communications has shaped and will always shape politics, and politics helps to shape communications. Neither can ever operate in silence or by trying to escape each other. But when, for the first time in human history, a system of communications can deliberately or accidentally come to alter democracy by controlling information and by shaping minds, communications and politics must come together, must combine to defend and advance that precious asset of accountable governance, which is democracy. First, because all alternatives to even flawed democracy are ugly in their oppression, in their denial of freedom and creativity. There is no enlightened despotism, because tyranny cannot afford to allow enlightenment of any kind. Second, because most people who are politically conscious, certainly the great majority of those who seek and achieve democratic election, want to participate in and be representative of a virile, plural democracy with its potentially infinite opportunities, securities, and liberties. The preconditions of that are eternal vigilance and effective action. The task of democratic government is getting harder. The odds against success in achieving regulation and sustaining freedom are getting higher, but so too are the stakes, and the price of failure is unthinkable. The time of unsuspecting myopia, of comatose complacency, of deferential democracy, of bewildered inactivity must end. Action now is vital. We are already way behind the challenge.